Welcome to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast with Darren Mitchell. If you're a sales leader looking to take your leadership to a whole new level, then this is the podcast for you. We'll be exploring tips, techniques, and strategies to help you take your leadership to the exceptional level and allow you to enjoy more money, more meaning, and better sales results. Welcome back to the Exceptional Sales Leader Podcast. Darren Mitchell here on what is a beautiful Friday in Melbourne, a beautiful summer's day, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. James Chitwood coming in from, it's a suburb of Chicago. I think it's Naperville. Is that how you pronounce it? Naperville,
Yes, sir.
Chicago,
Exactly.
Illinois. Welcome
Yeah.
to the podcast, Dr. James.
Thank you, Darren. It is not a beautiful summer, sunny day here in Chicagoland. Let me tell you that.
Well, because we're on the opposite ends of the earth, is there any snow in Chicago this time of year?
It depends on the year. I mean, we haven't had real snowstorms here in over a decade, and there's a little bit of snow on the ground, maybe a couple inches,
Okay.
and so we haven't had that in a while. So it's actually kind of nice to see.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
Well, hey, looking forward to this conversation. We've been connected on LinkedIn for a little while, and you are a performance culture expert. That's your business. You've also got a background in the Army, and you've written a book in 2024, I believe. Wrote the book "Leadership Is Not Enough."
Correct.
Really looking forward to this conversation because I love, just before we press record, had a bit of a conversation around sometimes how leaders in organizations, whether that be operational leaders or sales leaders, are thrust into a leadership position without necessarily wanting to take up that mantle. So love to delve into all the relevant topics around why leadership is not enough. Before we jump into that, sorry, are you going to say something?
No, no, go ahead, please.
Because as I said, this is a fireside chat, and I got no questions. As people who listen
All
to
right.
this, we just fire from the hip. Love to know a little bit about your background, James, in terms of, I know you've been in the armed forces. You mentioned in a note to me earlier before Christmas, brought up in the 70s and the old school sales sort of process. A bit about your background and what has led you to do the work that you do today.
Yeah, sure. My father was a salesperson. My uncle developed a sales training process called track selling back in the 70s. And so this has been part of my culture, part of my life, my entire life. Like I first went through the training at 13.
They
I
start
don't
them
think I
young in
got,
Chicago.
yeah, yeah. I don't know if I got much out of it at that time. I after high school joined the Army in order to get college fund money. Got out of the Army, went to college, and then my wife was in a sales job with an organization, and um, it was in Detroit. And so my wife had an opportunity to move into management in Detroit, and they said, "Well, we met Jim. We'll give him a job as a rep. No worries." And so my uncle gave me one of his books when I was doing that, and everything clicked back, and I used track selling from that get go, and was just wildly successful using it. So sales has just been always part of my DNA. I had never planned to do what I was doing. I pursued a doctorate simply because it was hard. Literally, I had a friend who's like, "Hey, Jim, we both have masters. I'm going to go do this thing. I want to study, buddy. What do you think?" Stupid me. I'm like, "Yeah, sure.
Why
Um,
not?
why not? How hard could it be?" It's really, really hard, by the way. Um, I wasn't my plan, man. And so, my career has been in higher education, and when I decided to pursue my doctorate, so many people in my program were doing this so that they could do what I'm doing. They wanted to write books, they wanted to be consultants, they wanted to be quote unquote experts in fields, and that was their mission. And mine wasn't. I was just like, I'm just doing this because it's hard. And then when I studied and so I was leading an organization that had a strong sales focus. And so I decided I had an idea for a book, and a provost of mine was like, "Hey, Jim, that's a really great idea for a book. Don't you
Yeah.
dare try to write a dissertation on it because you're not passionate about it and you'll never get it done." And she was right. And I said, "Okay, well, what am I passionate about?" "Well, I'm passionate about sales. I'm passionate about leadership because I'm studying organizational leadership." And so I thought, well, why don't I study the impact of leadership and job satisfaction on employee productivity in a sales department, right?
Mm.
And when I got my results, they were not what I expected. And I just chalked it up to, okay, interesting. I'm just going to go back and do my job. Right. And so I did that forever. And my wife's been telling me for a decade, hey, Jim, why don't you go consult, man? You need to consult. You've got too much going on in that head of yours. Get it out there,
Mm.
go to the world. But I couldn't do it unless I had an original thought, right? And so I couldn't just, I could have done what so many of my peers had done in the doctoral program, which was use whatever empirical tools they were using, and then to go be experts in that and consult on it. And that's not what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So, I decided, okay, what's up here that is of value to the world? And then I had that great aha moment. I saw my history, I saw the military, I saw my dissertation. All these pieces came together in that one bright moment. And then I thought, okay, here it is. I've got something new to give to the world. And that's what brought me and you together today.
Wow. It's
Yeah.
it's interesting, isn't it? And uh, as you were talking about the fact that why people do PhDs, why they do dissertations, why they do MBAs, and often I was talking to somebody yesterday about this topic specifically around MBA and how many people believe that the MBA is almost like well, in their mind, a guarantee that they'll get the recognition, the position, the status, and maybe the income that comes with it. And it's not always the case because you can be a very, very smart person intellectually, but not be able to translate that into practicality within an organization and a team environment. So the fact that you said you're doing it not for all of that, you're doing it because it was hard. Just tell me a bit about that because your backgrounds, you've been in the army, so obviously that was physically demanding. And doing something like this, was it more the mental challenge rather than the accolades that may have come from
Absolutely.
it?
Absolutely, Darren. I like to say the infantry tested my body and my doctorate tested my mind.
Yeah,
Less than 2% of the population has a doctorate in America, at least. And I knew that. So when I did it, I thought, well, gosh, if I can get through this, then I know that I can learn anything I need to learn. And
yeah,
that was really it. It was just, the Army taught me that I can push my body. I can go without food. I can go in pain. I can push my body. I learned how a long time ago. And same thing with my doctorate. Now I know that I can push my brain to learn what I wouldn't have expected myself to be able to learn.
love it, love it.
Yeah.
And as a doctor, I've got to say this as a bit of a side note. When you go
Mhm.
onto a plane, do you actually put your name doctor in the on the airline ticket?
I don't, but in full transparency, I have it on my credit card. And somebody once was like, Jim, why do you have doctorate on your credit card? I'm like, because I can,
Because I can, because I've got one and you don't.
right? But yeah, I don't ever want somebody to be on a plane and go, hey, is there a doctor on the plane? No,
That's
man.
right. So,
You ever see the movie The Hangover?
yeah, yes, I have.
So the one character they give all the grief to is a dentist, and his friends keep going, "Yeah, but you're not a real doctor." So it's kind of the same thing. I can't save anybody's life. I can just help them be smarter.
That's right. Oh, love it, love it. So I want to delve into this concept of leadership because I mean, full transparency, I do a lot of leadership training, I do a lot of sales
Sure.
training, I do a lot of sales leadership training. So I work with all of them. Um, let's just talk about this concept of leadership and maybe the distinction between management because there's almost been, and I share this a lot with teams. If you go back to the 90s and if you're looking for leadership books, they were very few and far between. They're all management books. And then through the 2000s and now it's very difficult to find a management book because it's all leadership. And I'm very big on saying to people, hey, you need to have both management and leadership capabilities to be a well-rounded individual to be able to lead your team, but you've got to
Mhm.
have skill set in both areas, right? So your I guess the purpose of the book and the title, Leadership is Not Enough, did that evolve, or was that something that you started out with and you almost wanted to, I guess, prove a thought that you want to have some evidence to support that? How did that come about?
Yeah, it was not planned, man. It was that great aha moment from God in the universe showing me what was true out there. So my dissertation showed me that statistically, um, leadership was not statistically relevant to the performance of the team. And when I got those results, I thought, well, how can that be? I'm a leader, right? It's full of hubris, right? It's all got to be the leader. And so when I got these results, I was like, wait, what? And being a good researcher, I did what's important is went out there and looked at a lot of studies and actually a lot of data to support the fact that um, it's not all about the leader to get the team what they're doing. And I got a lot of different thoughts based upon what you said earlier, but to stay on track to your question,
Mm,
it was I had to look back through, and here's a really good example of why it's not all about the leader. If you look at the military, everybody thinks that I'm just going to talk about the American military, that the American military is built upon great leaders.
mm,
It's actually a complete fallacy. The American military is a system that creates great leaders. So the great leaders are the outcome of a system that produces them, right?
mm.
And if you look at the military, if it was all about the leaders, the system would completely fail because every 2 years you've got a leadership rotation. Every 4 years you've got a personnel rotation. The
Mm.
system is so strong that everybody knows what they're doing. So regardless of who's there on point at any time, they understand the system and how to perform, right? And when you've got a great leader, well, that can just exemplify and grow results. And the beauty of a great system is that when you have a terrible leader, it minimizes the damage from them.
Interesting, because I
So
was
my
going to
whole
ask you.
model didn't really make sense until
Yeah.
I looked back upon the military.
So what you're saying then, it's the system or the environment in an organization that is the underlying foundation of high performance or sustainable high performance. And the leader who plugs into that can amplify that, or in some cases maybe minimize it, but the system will have almost like a minimum foundational effect.
Yeah, absolutely, Darren. I like to say it like this: leadership is like the icing on a cake. You got to bake your management cake first,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Which means you need to know what are the fundamentals in terms of the key metrics, key objectives, and focus on those minimum requirements or the non-negotiables, and then everything on top of that is like the layers of the cake.
Yeah, absolutely. The layers of the cake. So my model that I put forward in my book is called the track model, and it's really the basics, man. I mean, I don't claim to have produced rocket science here. What I do claim to have done is taken disparate bits of information and put them into one coherent thought, because everybody looks at these separately. I look at them as one strategy, and that's really the difference. So you just talked about KPIs. That's accountability, right? So my model is I put it in track TRAC simply because it makes sense that way. But really, the
Yeah.
first, and that's training, recognition, accountability, and communication. I believe those are the basics of your operating structure in your organization. And you talked
Mm.
about KPIs, absolutely clear and transparent. Accountability is required for every darn position. I can't tell you how many small companies are out there and other duties as assigned is the norm. And there are no true KPIs because they just keep throwing stuff at people and
Yeah.
they haven't defined anything. So accountability has to exist.
Mm.
Um, One of the departments that is always cut from organizations is training, right? And so now I'm not a big fan of training departments as trainers. I'm a fan of training departments as the creators of the training material that is then delivered by coworkers
Hmm.
or managers or other departments, right? Like I'm a real big believer in that peer-to-peer training level. So you've got accountability when somebody's not getting it done. Now you got to bring in training. Who does the training becomes the next question. And
Yeah.
that connects itself to recognition because I really believe that the best person to train is either the direct supervisor or it's a member of the team who's getting it done.
Mm.
Right. Real big believer in that. So now we are recognizing that coworker for their excellence, which lifts them up. And when we have one employee training another employee, we're now building social bonds between them. And
Mm.
one of the most powerful bonds within an organization is that social bond. And it's the element of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that most organizations fail to grasp miserably. They think social bonding is like, company parties and that kind of stuff. Yeah, that matters. Breaking of bread matters, but it needs to get a lot deeper at the
Yeah.
organizational operational structure. And then communication is that thing that just holds it all together.
And communication is an interesting one because I love your take on this and whether you saw this through your research. The number of leaders that lead by absence. And that is they're separated from their team. They've got the office. It could be a corner office. They've got the door. They're always looking at spreadsheets, working on strategy, managing upwards, and
Hmm.
not being visible to the team. So, from a communication perspective, my belief is the most effective leaders and the most high performing teams have their leader, their manager, in and amongst the team on a regular basis, lifting, pulling their
Absolutely.
sleeves up, doing the things that need to be done, and giving people the opportunity and constantly communicating.
Yeah, constantly communicating. There's that old adage of management by walking around,
Yeah.
really important. I really believe that you need to layer on top of that recognition by walking around as well. If,
Mm.
as a manager, all you do is walk around and point out opportunities for improvement, well, then people aren't going to look forward to you walking around, right?
That's all
They're going to be like,
right.
oh
It's
gosh, here
like,
he
shh,
comes.
here
Jim's
comes
coming.
Jim.
Get busy, right? But if they also believe that you're going to walk around with recognition, well, that's a whole different. Hey, Jim's coming. What? Okay. Maybe he'll say something about me, right? So you got to do both, right? There's never a single thing. You got to do management by walking around, accountability, opportunities for improvement, being involved. Then you also need to make sure you're recognizing people as you go.
Absolutely. And in the train, I love the track model. It's because it's really it's simple, but I don't want to say it's simplistic, but it's practical. So
Very practical.
so the training could, from my perspective, the training could be multiple different things. It could be obviously formalized
Hmm.
training, it could be one-on-one coaching, mentoring, ad hoc sort of conversations. It's
Yeah,
and I love the idea that it's peer to peer. Because,
yeah,
hey, full disclosure, I'm a trainer, I'm a facilitator, so I love coming into organizations. But one of my biggest bugbears is particularly if I'm running a sales training for a sales team. The leader is often not in the room with the sales team getting trained, and it's a really annoying thing. And I always ask the question, where is the leader? Because 100% of the time, the team are asking me, hey, how come the leader's not here? What's going on?
right. Yeah,
What
yeah.
sort of message?
We have to be here. That person doesn't,
Yeah, this is for
right?
them. They've got the problem. It's not me. I know everything. So that just
Yeah,
creates this big gap, right?
yeah, yeah.
So, so
And if as a leader you don't show up to training, you're basically telling your team, "Nah, this training doesn't really matter. I don't
that's
care
it.
about it."
That's it.
Right? And
Yeah.
and how can you get someone to engage in something you don't care about?
No. 100%. Which
Yeah,
your point on getting the sales leader or a peer or a person who wants to improve and develop their, I guess, their communication skills, their presentation skills to do the training is such a powerful thing because it's held within the, I guess, the ecosystem of the team.
yeah. That I describe culture as just as the energy that connects people, right? And when you've got people training each other, that energy gets so strong.
Yeah.
And it's just such a powerful way, again, to build social bonding in an organization.
Yeah. So let's talk about sales specifically because there's a quote that I saw which I really resonated with and I totally believe this and understand it that it's a helping profession, and the sales leader's sole responsibility is to develop the potential of the team. I'm part of an organization that does some great work around working specifically with sales managers, and their whole remit is that the role of the sales manager is not to grow sales. The role of the sales manager is to grow the salespeople who grow sales. So it
Absolutely.
very much fits in with this. So
Hmm.
can you talk a little bit about your experience in working with teams, specifically in the sales, and how sometimes we have to get sales leaders to embrace this responsibility? Because as we talked about before we press record, sometimes sales leaders are thrust into it because they've been a great individual contributor, and they don't necessarily understand that the skill set and the responsibility is going to be slightly different when they take on the responsibility of having people to report to them. So, how does the sales leader then embrace and start to build the environment, knowing that it's not the leadership that's going to actually drive the high performance, it's more the environment that will drive the high performance?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that bothers me most is when I see an organization give a sales leader a quota. How, if you give someone a quota, that's all they're going to drive to. They're not
Yeah,
going to worry about their team, right? Because now they have a number on top of their head and they're going to drive to it, right? Or they wouldn't be a sales leader in the first place, right?
that's it.
Um, so what I do is make sure that leader does a 50-50 meeting, with every one of their employees. And what I mean by a 50-50 is half of that's quantitative. You have to talk performance.
Mm.
In sales, I believe in every single department, but most definitely in sales, we have to talk about performance, right? So half of it's quantitative. And if every one of your meetings is only quantitative, people aren't going to look forward to your meetings.
Mm.
The other part is qualitative, right? And that's when you're training, that's when you're developing your people, right? In that one-on-one, in that private meeting. One of the mistakes I remember, I took over an organization that was a turnaround, and I found out really quickly that my sales leader would just walk around and tap people on the shoulder and say, "Hey, let's go have our one-on-one right now." Right? And so those people walked into that meeting unprepared, right? And it doesn't respect the individual and doesn't respect their time at all, and
No.
it puts them, you know, in a bad place. I always get sales leaders to, number one, have it scheduled, regularly recurring. Number two, the team brings the numbers to you.
Mm.
You don't bring the numbers to them, right? And so they have to be able to produce the numbers. They have to be able to analyze them so that they can come in and have a conversation, and you can discuss how to leverage what went right and how to fix or improve what might need improvement. And
Mm.
that's that manager's job.
It's it's as you're talking, I'm thinking back to my own environments and the managers that I reported to. They would often do that. Or here's the thing: they often didn't have one-on-ones
Yeah.
because they were too busy strategizing or doing
Yeah.
forecasting. And so what's interesting is not only did they not do one-on-ones, they didn't do coaching, they didn't do mentoring, and they very rarely got involved in any training. It was almost like, well, I've made the leap to leadership, so I don't need to do
Yeah.
any of that. So I'm now in the upper echelons. It was
Right. Yeah.
ridiculous, and they wondered why the environment was toxic, lower performing, and a bit of a, when I say a mismatch, there was lots of different people who were up and down in terms of month to month. Some days that have months that have a great month, other months that have terrible months, but there was no consistency. And the vibe in the team, it was not a team. It was a group of individual contributors.
Absolutely right. Right. That organization didn't spend any time on social bonding, right? They didn't understand how to build a team structure.
Yeah.
They allowed a manager. The challenge for most frontline managers is, because they're not trained to manage employees, they try to make employees do the job exactly the way they did it.
Yeah.
And so now they're micromanaging, right? And the truth of the matter, especially in sales, is that we're all a little different, right? And so if you try to make somebody do it exactly the way you did it, and you're probably going to fail,
Mm.
unless your organization has an actual sales process that everybody is doing. That's a different scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes back to what you talked about before in terms of the system. And you made
Mm-hmm.
reference to the army as a system. And then
Yeah.
you plug people into the system, and the system is the one that generates the consistency and ultimately the sustainability. What that
Yeah.
will also do, and this is okay because we talked also about the fact that some leaders, because they're thrust into the leadership role, it's not going to be for everybody. And it's okay not to become, a great leader, because if you don't want to be a great leader, then just be a great individual contributor. But the system will actually spit that out, and I say that respectfully. Um,
Yeah.
so from a system point of view, interested in the work that you do with organizations in terms of helping them turn around, helping them improve. When you talk about environment or the system, are there some key things that, from your perspective, either on the research or the work that you're doing, are absolutely fundamental to have in place as almost like the building blocks or the ingredients of the cake that you referred to earlier?
Sure. The first building block is creating an internal communication strategy, right? So many organizations spend all their time, a lot of money, on external communication strategies. And then basically, when they talk to their employees, they use brand speak, right? And it's a one-way communication channel. It's from the top down, and nobody
Mm,
listens,
mm,
right? So the very first thing you need to do is create a three-way communication channel. And by three-way, I mean top to bottom, bottom to top, and then across teams,
mm,
right? So that everybody's talking. Part of that communication strategy is documenting the one-on-ones, right? So that what's happening in those conversations is getting up through the chain of command. They're able to hear what's happening in the one-on-ones because it's all documented, right? I really believe that the very first thing you need to do is that. Second is accountability. You got to make sure that every job is clearly defined. Everybody understands what they're being held accountable to, how they
Mm.
work together, how the team, entire organization works, right? All the KPIs align. Well, you got a mismatch if they don't. So because they all align, they should, then that needs to be explained. And everybody needs to understand how their one movement in that wheel affects the entire engine.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's a lot of teams that don't drive that accountability. It's almost like
Yeah.
assumed that people know what they need to do, and it's not explicitly explained to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also see leaders will talk about the accountability and how important it is, but then never do any of the follow up, right? And it's hard to do the follow up, right? It takes work to constantly monitor, right? And say, okay, well, employee X was here, right? And let's try. Like it takes effort, right? And
Mm.
and 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 so if you haven't built a good communication strategy that aligns with your accountability, then you don't have the systems in place to help this tracking to make it easier on the manager. And that's
Yeah.
kind of one of the key points to a good system.
And when you're talking about accountability, it's not just for the individual contributors in the team, it's what's the accountability metrics and key non-negotiables for the sales manager, for the sales director, for the chief revenue officer, every role within the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you've got a well-oiled machine and a good system, you should be able to plug anybody into that system and know, hey, this is the blueprint that this role needs to follow. This is how we're
Yeah.
going to measure success, which means you can now
Yep.
focus on the execution because you've got the foundational pieces in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so many organizations don't have a sales process,
No.
right? And you just hire people because they know how to sell, right? And now you've got 12 people, 12 different sales processes occurring, right? And so the manager has a really hard time managing them because they're just all over the place.
Mm,
If you have a really good system and everybody's doing it, it makes it so much easier on that frontline manager because they're no longer managing the personalities of the people, they're managing the process of the sales.
yeah. And that's the repeatable process. So it doesn't
Yep.
matter who's in there. It's almost like, well, this is how we do business here, right? And it's not an
Yep.
arrogant thing. It actually breeds consistency. So
Yes.
you can have all different types of personality types that come into the organization, and they can all thrive in that organization because the system is in place, because it's a system that
Yes.
will actually drive the outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. And as long as the person does the steps, they're going to be successful. And that's really the key, you
And
know?
from your perspective, from working in organizations and helping them turn around and doing all this research, how does that now play out in terms of customers dealing with these organizations? Because sometimes what organizations talk about is, hey, we put the customer at the center of everything we do. We love our customers, and yet their behaviors are anything but demonstrating that they love their customers because it's all conditional. When you've got a
Yeah.
really well-defined system, where you've got people who plug into the system, can you just talk about, and maybe that was part of your research, what the outcome is for customers, and therefore the I guess the flow-on effect to that particular organization in terms of is it longer term contracts? Is it higher levels of customer satisfaction? What's I guess the byproduct from a customer perspective when you have a high-performing team plugged into a system?
Well, we'll start it at the prospect, right? Because before you have a customer, you have a prospect. And if you've
Mm,
got a great system, then you can always know where in your sales cycle your prospect is, right? So that whether or not you're going to close that sale isn't a question. It's a mathematical probability at that point because you've
mm,
already done the math. You already know how somebody comes through. So once they do become a customer, right, you've opened up a long term relationship. It's a much stronger relationship because you know that everybody experienced the same thing, right? You know that every customer had the exact same steps that worked for them. They had the exact same after sale follow up. Everybody went through the same processes, right? And so when you do that, you can create that consistency.
mm,
Consistency of experience is critical to measuring long term satisfaction, right?
mm.
If not, you've got all these different experiences and you can't really tell which one is dominant. But if you've created this environment, then you can create a consistent customer experience that you could then leverage for long term success.
Yeah. And that creates differentiation in the marketplace
Yes, it does.
because there are a lot of organizations, and even thinking some of the service providers in Australia, they talk a good game, but I guess their performance doesn't necessarily consistently back up the talk that they
Right.
deliver to the marketplace. So, and from a internal then perspective, in terms of employee engagement, longevity, what's the evidence behind that in terms of, I think anecdotally you'd think, well, if you've got a good system, if you've got good leadership, if you've got good managers in place, you've got a great system, then chances are that people want to stick around and want because they're going to be developed.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I would just add to what you said, make sure there's a good training program in place and a good recognition, right? And when you do have a great training program in place, then you can really develop your people. And if it's a cultural norm, and that's kind of one of the requirements of my model, is that training can't be something you do.
Mm,
It has to be something you live. It has to be a cultural norm. Everybody's involved in training, right? Because right now, what happens for most organizations is training is poop. Nobody likes training because it takes them away, right? And it's just the stuff that's done to them, right? Versus if they are part of it, if it's a cultural norm, then that new employee who comes in isn't being trained by a department. They're being trained by their coworkers. They're being trained by
mm,
their supervisors. They're being trained by other members of other departments, right? And so it's building that social bond, which increases employee retention. I remember once I had this uh, just a stellar organization under my command, and we were doing extremely well, and we had broken all the norms. And at one point, I was in a conversation with one of the HR leaders from corporate, and she goes, "Jim, you realize you have the highest retention rate of any one of our locations. We had 40 something locations at that time, 41 to be precise." And I was kind of taken aback because I'm not an easy boss.
mm.
I'm just the kind of boss who's very transparent, who says, listen, if you want to do it, I'm here with you all the way. You don't? Well, then we got to have another conversation, right?
Yeah.
This is what we got to do. And so, when you create that environment where your training becomes your cultural norm, everybody understands your accountability metrics. Everybody is really clear on that. Communication is strong. Everybody's involved and they're all experiencing recognition in one way or another. That's a
Mm.
type of environment people want to work within. What they don't want to work within is one where they never know what the next day is going to hold. That's very disconcerting to most human beings.
Especially when you've got a manager that they come in, you think, oh, I'm not sure whether I'm going to get Jekyll or Hyde today. It was
Yeah.
actually funny. There was a I'm not sure whether it's actually true. I heard an anecdote. There was an executive in the States, and he had an executive assistant that would sit out the front of his office, and on her desk she would have two color coffee mugs, which would indicate, I guess, the mood of the executive that particular day. So if there was a green coffee mug on the table, it was all good. He was in a good mood, so please proceed. If it was red, turn around and go back and come another time. It wasn't good.
That's terrible. I was involved in a conversation once. It was an executive development program early on in my career. And I was the only one who stood on this soapbox, which is we're human. We have bad days. As leaders, you got to put that in a drawer when you
Yeah.
walk out of your office. You got to put that in a drawer and focus on lifting your people up. And I remember at many, like, listen, my job's not to smile and make people happy. My job is to drive the numbers. I said, well, if your people aren't happy, they're not going to perform and hit your numbers, right? And so you have to reckon. And what's interesting is the research for my book. One of the things I found, and I knew this anecdotally,
Mm,
but I didn't know it scientifically, which is actually stress is contagious. It comes out of our pores,
mm.
right? Like literally stress comes out of our pores. That's how contagious it is, right? And it is most acute when it's the leader that's stressed. The people below them experience that stress at a higher level than anywhere else. So when you've got a leader who's walking around stressed, everybody below them is getting stressed,
That is fascinating.
right?
And I talk all the time about the team becomes and is a reflection of the leader, and that just brings it to even more fruition. And I didn't know that. I didn't actually know that that's how stress can actually be communicated.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, Send me your address after this, Darren. I'll send you a copy of my book.
Love it, love it.
Yeah.
Question I wanted to ask you in relation to environment, and a lot of companies have mission statements, vision, all that sort of stuff, but
Mm.
values, right? Let's talk about company values because I and you're smiling, you're smiling. What does that mean? Does that mean, oh, I
It's
love
the
values?
biggest unsupported thing organizations do, right? And I, I just can't stand hypocrisy. It drives me nuts. And so I like, saying one thing and doing something else. It doesn't work for me. So, back to the training. One of the things I say to companies is what you need to recognize is that 85% of employers are not training their frontline managers.
Yeah,
And the thing about it is, if you want them to get everybody on board with your mission and vision and values, well, then you need to build that into that frontline trainer so that you explain here is how this relates to our mission, vision, and values, right?
mm,
Here is how that connects so that everybody really is driving to that. Um, when organizations, when there's a disconnect between those mission, vision, and values and what people are experiencing every day, your turnover is going to be very high.
yeah. Absolutely. And often that means that you're going to have, you might have some values sitting on a laminated sheet around the office, which, by the way, very quickly becomes, oh, what's that? Don't even see it, right?
I don't even see
Um,
it.
so that becomes almost like, well, that's there, but the real values are what we see play out on a daily basis. So they become the
Right.
real ones because they're the unwritten values. And that's what you
Right.
actually see, which sets the undertone of the whole environment. So what we're saying
Absolutely.
there is that the leaders have to be very clear on what their value is, but also think about what are the specific behaviors that they need to demonstrate, but what are the behaviors that they want to see play out in their team that will
Hmm.
connect to that. So it has to be meaningful, it has to be practical.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
half the time,
Absolutely. Did you ever see the TV show Ted Lasso?
oh mate, I reckon if anybody, people need to watch that multiple times because it
Yeah.
is brilliant.
It is brilliant. And remember that sign, believe,
Yes.
right? That sign, believe. Everything was around belief, belief in each other, believe they could be successful, believe in a better day, believe in being positive, right? And you saw that being implemented in everything they did. And there's a
Mm,
reason they all touched it, that sign. And there's a reason when it got torn up, they were so unhappy, right? Because it isn't just a sticker on or a laminated board, right? It was what they did. It was the
mm,
ethos of that organization, right? And when you can create that type of understanding, there's
mm.
nothing more powerful.
That's it. And sometimes there's high performing teams that people from the outside look into and think, I don't know how they do this. Because we are doing what they're doing, but they're getting better results. They've got better engagement. They've got better customer retention, whatever the case might be. What is the difference? Well, often it comes into what you just said. They've got this internal belief that it's insatiable, it's contagious, and it's unbreakable.
Yeah, people often ask me, Jim, what is a performance culture? It's really cute that you have that phrase. Like literally, my website is performanceculture.expert. And I say a performance culture is when everybody is focused on the performance of the organization. Everybody is a stakeholder, right? And when
Mm,
they recognize their role as a stakeholder in the success of that organization, when they're all focused on its performance, you've created a performance culture. So many people just go and they do their job, right? And they're doing just what's necessary to do their job. They're not going above and beyond, right?
yeah.
That's not a performance culture, right? When everybody's working together to drive that organization forward, well, now you've created the right environment.
And people that do that because they're focused on how do we make the organization better? How do we make the organization sustainable? They'll always get taken care of. They'll always get the recognition. But
Absolutely.
and it's often as you're talking, I'm thinking this analogy that I sometimes use about the campfire. And people that
Yeah.
sit around the campfire, who's responsible for making sure that the campfire is first of all built in the first place, but second of all, making sure the campfire is maintained, right? So who goes to
Yeah.
collect the wood? Or do you have people sitting around with their marshmallow on the end of the stick, just putting it in there because they want to serve themselves to get themselves nourished, right? It's
Right.
what can we do to the team? What contribution are we making to the team? What contribution are we making to the organization? And we're doing that for the greater good, which might sound really woo-woo, right? But actually is true. If every single person on a sales team, for example, focused on how can we make the team and the organization better, I guarantee over time their results would be significantly better than those that says, what can I get from this customer? How can I protect my patch against my competitor? Because I can't let Jim into my patch because that means he might get some, and it's all commission breath.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And how many leaders wouldn't go cut the wood for that fire? Right? How many
Very
leaders
few.
would just, hey, I got the saw. Your job is to go sit over there. I'm gonna make this fire for you, and then we're gonna sit around and we're gonna chat. Right?
Yeah.
That I would say. Listen, the title of my book is "Leadership is Not Enough." I'm not saying it doesn't matter. Leadership matters, right? It's just not enough,
Yeah.
right? And so, if that leader went and built a fire, but then there was nobody wanting to sit around it, right? That's one type of environment. Or if the leader's just like, hey, John, go build that fire. I'm going to sit over here in my tent, right? That's another type of environment, right? So
Yeah.
leadership matters. It's just not everything. It's just not enough.
And as part of this, I couldn't help but not include some form of conversation around, I guess, emotional intelligence in this realm as well. So a leader who is not self-aware, who's not socially aware, actually starts to negatively impact the environment rather than enhance the environment. Have you got thoughts, or is there any part of your work that included, as part of the leadership, part of the environment, the importance of a leader being emotionally intelligent?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of assessments, but I will say emotional intelligence is critical. It
Yeah.
is so important, right? If an individual doesn't know how they're being received by another person, then they are completely lost. And it is one of the worst traits as a leader. If they have no idea that what's coming out of their mouth is the reaction that's being received, then that's just a terrible leader versus the one who understands the emotional connection with
Mm,
another human being and how powerful that can be. It's just so critically important.
it is. And unfortunately, there are lots of people getting promoted today that are very
Mm,
smart. They've got great results, but they're lacking common sense. They're lacking the
yeah,
natural gravitas that you need to have in a leader that's going to that underpin a strong environment, high performance culture. It's
yeah.
staggering. And I look at things. How did that person get promoted? Like, what? I mean, they're pretty smart, but you know what? I wouldn't be promoting them because I can see a lot of they're not self-aware. They can't hold a conversation. They can't train. They can't communicate, for example. Right?
Yeah, the self-aware. One of my favorite questions to ask somebody after. So here, I'll give this to you and all your listeners. My favorite final question to ask in an interview is, I will tell the person all the reasons I want to hire them. I will list all of these great reasons, and I'm going to say, now I want you to tell me a reason why I should not hire you. All right. Salespeople are terrible at this because they're just, wow, and then they just go on to, but I hate it when they're like, oh, well, you might not want somebody who works as hard as I do, right? Or some bull like that, right? Really, all I'm looking for is self-assessment. It's the only
Yeah,
reason I ask a question. I
yeah,
want to hear if they're smart enough to be able to assess. Well, a simple self-assessment related answer is all I'm looking for, because a
yeah.
person who can't self-assess cannot improve.
No, that's it. That's it. They've already reached their threshold.
Yeah, they're it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Jim, as we look into 2025, are you seeing any trends, anything that is top of mind for you in relation to leadership, team, sales performance that you think leaders can, I guess, grab hold of? Not so much as a theme, but something to be conscious of that can lead to hopefully higher performance this year.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of organizations need to recognize the fact that the next generation coming up is not interested in being promoted. So many of them just want to do their job. So if there's one thing I would say to an org is, you need to make sure you've created a system where somebody can stay in their role for 20 years and be successful.
Yeah,
If you don't have that, okay, we'll just say 10 years, right? If you don't have a way for a person to stay in their role for 10 years and be successful, you're not going to be successful as an organization, because this next generation, they're not interested because they've seen the rest of us burn out because
Yeah.
of it, right? So that's my one thing that I would say is you need to recognize this coming trend that is actually not coming, it's here now. And if you don't have a way for an employee to stay in their job for 10 years and be successful, and by successful, I mean be able to beat the cost of living so that they can continue to thrive,
Yeah.
well, then your organization in the long term is going to have too much turnover and you're not going to be successful.
It's a really interesting point because it's almost like the mindset is, well, you're in a role for a certain amount of time. So the next logical thing is, what's the next role? What's the next promotion? And organizations, I mean, they need people to be promoted to continue to get to thrive, but also understanding that a lot of people don't want to be promoted. They just want to be really good at what they do and always become experts at that. And it's not to say they get into a comfort zone, but if they're in their rhythm, if they're in their flow state, then let them do that because that can enhance the
Absolutely.
organization's performance.
Absolutely enhances the organization's performance. It is critical to have people who want to be successful in the role they're in. If
Yeah.
everybody's looking for the next job, you've got a real problem in your organization.
That's right. Which basically says we've got a cultural issue. We've got a
Yes,
system issue.
exactly. Right. Versus if you've
Man,
created one where people are like, man, I love my job. I don't want to get promoted. I want to just keep doing this as an individual contributor and know that I can pay my bills for the next 10 years and be successful. That's so powerful to the success of a performance culture.
oh, it is. And it means that for a lot of us as leaders and as managers, we almost have to change our perception as to what success equals. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean promotion. It maybe means excellence. It maybe means personal excellence. It might be mean how do I expand my role without taking on more responsibility, but how can I add more value that gives me more satisfaction?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And that comes back to that one-on-one conversation. The only way you find that out is by having a qualitative conversation with your direct reports.
Which tying a whole bow around it, that's why it's not just about leadership, because you've got to have a system in place that is executable, that is consistent, and that can be sustainable.
Right.
And you've got to
Absolutely.
commit to it. Yeah,
Yeah. You have
love
to
it.
commit to it, and you got to bake it into your operating structure. It's got to be the
Absolutely.
norm.
Absolutely. So, Jim, I know you've got a dinner to get to, so love to know for people listening to this if they want to know more about you, connect with you, get a copy of the book. Where's the best place for them to do so?
Sure, yeah, you can get the book at leadershipisnotenough.com. That'll take you to a page it's got a link directly to purchase it. Of course, you can find it on Amazon.
Yeah,
You can find me at either drjameschitwood.com, or my consulting website is performanceculture.expert. One word, performanceculture.expert.
perfect. And I might even say LinkedIn as well, yeah?
Oh yeah, sorry. On LinkedIn. Um, Dr. James Chitwood, my bad. And yeah, I post content from my book regularly as a way to try to give to the world. So, reach out to me, connect with me. There will be information I pray will be of value to you.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, Dr. James Chitwood, it's been an absolute pleasure. I love the topic we've spoken about today, and it's certainly given me some more things to think about as I then go out and talk to leaders.
Good.
Greatly appreciate you taking the time on this Thursday, cooler
Yeah.
Thursday in Chicago, and thanks for being
Real
a guest on
chilly.
the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast.
Thank you, Darren. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, all the best. Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast. I trust the information in this episode has been helpful in your journey towards becoming exceptional. And remember, please take the time to rate the show, subscribe to the show so other people can find it. But also, if I can help you, jump on my calendar, go to leadwithdarren.com and let's have a conversation about how I can help you along your journey to being exceptional.